On this episode of China Unscripted, as the U.S. erupts in pro-Palestinian protests, the CCP hosts Hamas. The U.S. makes another diplomatic failure, and the Philippines delivers a devastating blow to the CCP. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chung.
And I'm Matt Ganezda.
So, Antony Blinken, I'm so glad people-to-people communications have been restored between China and the United States. It's really, it's such a relief that, the adults are back in the room and diplomacy can happen.
Yes. Explain what you mean, Chris.
Oh, so Blinken made his trip to China, and there was a whole thing last year of how he was scheduled to go to China, but that didn't happen because of the spy balloon.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried to cover up. The U.S. tried to cover up that there was a spy balloon because they didn't want it to interfere with the trip. But then stupid Americans with their cell phones had an opinion that the government didn't want. And
I thought you were going to say stupid Americans with their cell phones filmed the spy balloon.
Yeah, and then developed the opinions that the government didn't want.
Mm-hmm.
The American people really are not doing what the government wants. Get on that, American people.
I actually think that's pretty much the beauty of the American people.
You're a foreigner, Shelley, aren't you?
No, Chris, I am actually an American.
God bless America. But so after a whole bunch of kowtowing, literally in the case of Janet Yellen, the U.S. and Chinese officials are finally talking again. And so Blinken made another trip to China just this past week. And the crazy thing is, it's like just this. He's like a hamster in a wheel, just spinning around and around and around. They're talking. The things that they said that he talked to the other officials about are the same things that U.S. officials have always been talking.
But see, Chris, it's much more powerful to talk about them in person.
Yes, now they can lie directly to your face.
Yeah, as opposed to just lying over like a teleconference. I think we all learned from Zoom during the pandemic that that's not the ideal way to have meetings.
Right, because what if, you're in an important Zoom meeting with a Chinese leader and then he realizes you're not wearing pants?
Did Blinken wear pants in person? I just don't get Blinken. I don't understand how he functions.
Yeah, I do, because, so Blinken's the Secretary of State, right? And the State Department's job is diplomacy, which is, as they currently see it, is to have conversations with people. So while you see a hamster wheel, and I also see the hamster wheel, for Blinken, that spinning wheel is the whole world, right? That's the State Department's job. He's doing his job by having these diplomatic conversations.
Well, how does that explain why he wore
spinning
pants?
Wheel, the hamster spinning wheel is powering peace in our time?
No, it's powering further dialogue.
Uh-huh. Okay, as long as we just keep talking for the sake of talking.
I get what Matt's saying. It's like in California, the people in charge of solving the homelessness crisis, their jobs is to perpetually solve this problem. So it never gets solved. And the State Department's job is diplomacy, so they must have diplomacy.
But I feel like that's
stupid?
Well, it's kind of a tautology. So it's like you could be like, every job needs to continue to have that job. I don't think
it's the wrong way of looking at whatever department you run in the cabinet or any other major government position, right? Which is that when you are the head of a department, State Department in Antony Blinken's case, you see your job as to run that department, but it's easy to be blind to the larger strategic objectives of the administration, even though in theory you're meeting with the president all the time. But I'm not clear that what's happening is that the president is able to give a unified strategic direction to each of the cabinet positions, whether it's Treasury with Yellen or State with Blinken or defense or any of these things. I feel like there's not really a cohesion, and so what's happening is that each of these departments is kind of doing its own thing as best it can, but they're all in kind of hamster wheels because they're not giving this bigger picture.
I don't know if that's the problem. I don't know if that's the problem, actually.
Well, the reason I say that, and I don't know what's happening, in the White House, but I'm not seeing this larger strategic direction for the United States.
So what do you think is going on, Shelley?
Well, I'm going to say that even under the Trump administration's tough on China policies, right? Like that was supposedly the overarching thing, is that we were going to change the way we look at China as like a strategic adversary, not
Right.
just a competitor. And so there was some cohesion there. But then you still had, for example, like Treasury trying to undermine things. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, so you still have, I don't think it's just that there's no cohesion. I think that like you will have like individual departments or people like arguing for what things from their perspective. So like, you know,
Well, we
you
know.
always have like the people who are like, oh, you know, more sympathetic to Wall Street trying to gain influence, or more sympathetic, like, do you know
Right.
what I mean? So I think it's not just that there's no cohesion. I think that there is a cohesive Biden policy towards China, or Biden administration policy towards China,
And how would you summarize that?
going back to the strategic competitor. Like they still want to keep some of the like the tougher economic things that Trump put in place, like the tariffs, but at the same time, they, I think, have a philosophical difference about like what it means to, what like deterrence means, or what it means to like
They
try to
don't talk about the
avoid
Marxist
war.
learning.
So,
Yeah,
so what you're saying is they've got one foot on the train and the other on the platform.
kind of. I think. Like, I think that it is now no longer possible to go completely back to the engagement model of the 90s. But there are
Right.
obviously people within the Biden administration who would like to do that.
Because they've been
Yeah.
around since that era.
Well, we know that Blinken does not agree with Biden. Like, if we go back to that time, that wonderful moment, whoever that photog was who put the camera on Blinken, where Biden is being asked, like, do you still think Xi Jinping is a dictator? And he's like, yeah, of course he's a dictator.
And Blinken
But
just
it's
has
like
It's
this.
just
It's
like,
like-
he dies.
like
And,
his-
like, he wouldn't
he
have that opinion.
visibly winced. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, I think from his perspective, he's saying that he's thinking that, oh, now my job's much harder or whatever. But
Mhm.
yeah, so I don't.
Well, but what is his job, right? And I think he has a different view of his job than what I think his job ought to be.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think his job ought to be?
His job ought to be to make sure that America upholds American values with respect to foreign countries.
That is definitely. I don't think anybody in the State Department would say that that is the State Department's job.
Yeah, but the thing is, if we don't over the long term, over the course of decades or centuries, sort of have this strong American values and whatever you define that as, then over the long term, we will not achieve our larger objectives, and countries will lose respect for us for constantly, doing things that are stupid, right? Like all these things that we did in terms of working with China, in the late 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, we looking back, it's like, oh well, that was stupid,
Well, okay,
right? Because
but that's
we didn't try to uphold American values of liberty, for example. And you look at China and their horrible human rights abuses. America never tried to stand up for that, right? And had we done that from the get-go after Tiananmen and just kept on that pressure continuously, I think the U.S. would be stronger. And it would be stronger for a number of reasons, and not just with respect to diplomacy with China, but we wouldn't have shipped all those jobs to China, and we'd have stronger manufacturing in the United States. We'd have higher wages as a result, which spills over into all these aspects of the U.S. economy, which manifests as strength internationally with respect to every country, more stability in the currency, and all these things, right? And it's because, why did we lose all this? Because we dropped our American values for the false promise of having Wall Street make a little money in China.
Have you ever considered going into politics?
I would hate to be a politician.
But you get to tell people what to do. That's how American democracy works, right? Somebody just tells
You
everyone
vote,
what
you,
to do.
you vote for me, and I tell you what to do. And ideally, I run in a safe district that's either all blue or all red, and so I can keep my position for as long as I want and not have to serve my constituents at all. Oh
Pretty
man,
sweet
that
gig.
sounds like a great
Plus
deal.
all the insider trading you get to do.
Oh yeah, yeah,
so basically you want to be in Congress. You don't want to be in the executive.
yeah. Because Congress, you're not expected to do anything.
Amen.
Well, I kind of almost forgot what we were talking about
I was talking
before.
about
Blinken.
No, I
Yeah.
was talking about the America's need to uphold American values with respect to China policy, and that us not doing that over the last few decades has led to this horrible situation. And the State Department is not really considering this.
I would
They're
say
just
this.
considering how to have good relations.
I think this goes way before Tiananmen, though. I mean,
It goes back to the 70s, right?
yeah, I mean, you could make an argument that basically once the U.S. decided to normalize relations with the CCP, because of this like idea that strategically the CCP could help them against the Soviet Union, you've now made this triangulation where you're like, okay, this is against American values, but it is also in our interest to maybe do this strategically. And then that becomes that was the calculation, right? That
Right. I mean, I would have. It's hard for me to understand the politics of the mid 70s because I wasn't around then. But like, even if that
what
made
your
sense,
mustache was.
Oh, Matt's mustache is like the archetypical mustache. It's connected to this Platonic mustache that has always existed and is manifest in all mustaches everywhere.
so maybe what Shelley is saying is that I'm a classic.
No, I think she's saying your mustache is a pagan god and must be destroyed.
Shelley?
I said neither of those things.
What?
But it is interesting
We've
how
given you two choices. It's got to be one or the other. Capitalism or communism.
wow. I feel like this podcast is going off the rails, but in a different way than it usually goes off the rails.
Can I try to get it back on the rails here?
Yes.
Okay, so regardless of whether it was the right move in the 70s to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China, there have been opportunities to undo that. And Tiananmen was a great opportunity to
Do you mean to stop recognizing them or
either stop recognizing them or see if Taiwan wanted to. No, not at the time. Taiwan wouldn't have wanted to. But like,
you're suddenly remembering Taiwan wasn't so great in
no,
1989?
Taiwan was a fascist dictatorship until the 90s when it democratized. Right. I mean, that's I think well documented. But that's
I
not the
wonder how
point.
much that actually influenced U.S.-China policy, because one of the things that happened with this people-to-people communication that China's always been pushing with the U.S., or even like George Bush Sr., like he had like the people that he would speak to, and the illusion of friendship, and they always push the idea that, oh yeah, we're progressing towards democracy, we're heading there, and maybe like people in the U.S. saw like Taiwan becoming a democracy and be like, oh yeah. And so when these Chinese officials, when these CCP officials say, yeah, reforming is happening, just don't push too hard. That might have been like a proof for them. Like, oh yeah, if Taiwan can do it, surely China will. Let's keep working with them. Don't rock the boat.
I mean, I don't think that was the case in 1989 during the Tiananmen protests, but after another decade, by say 99, when the CCP launched like its next big persecution, which was against Falun Gong, like that could have been another opportunity to say,
Oh, by 99 we were too in it, right? Like
yeah, but like,
Look, Matt, you get more by giving them the palm of your hand instead of the back of your fist or whatever that asshole said.
who was this?
Bill
Bill
Clinton.
Clinton.
Oh.
I remember that speech. I was like, oh man, you're so dumb. This is going to go so badly.
I think he was pretty smart. I think he knew what he was doing.
Oh, that's very cynical.
Yes.
Well, so which
I
explains
mean, there
your
was
expletive.
there was the Chinagate scandal with the Clintons in the 90s.
Uh-huh.
All right. Well, at any rate, like there was no point at which it was easy to go back, but it's hard. It's always gets progressively harder to go back, and that's why even though Trump,
I mean, I don't think
for all his flaws, it was trying to go back even a little bit was extraordinarily difficult.
I don't think this is the right thing to say. We were trying to go back. I think the problem is that the idea was that, okay, even if we normalize trade relations with them, even if we interlink our economies, we should still be able to stand up for human rights and American values. Like if you go back and look at what people were saying back then, like not the Clinton thing, but I read a lot of the speeches in that were made in Congress when people were debating whether to give China permanent most favored nation trading status.
Right.
Right. So like a lot of it was like being like Biden made a speech that was like, oh yes, human rights are important and we shouldn't stop, but like, we need to like help them economically, whatever. But like no one was cynical enough to be like human rights don't matter. But the idea was like, oh, like at least the stated idea was that like this is not going to keep us from still standing up for American values.
It might
And
help.
Right.
so like there was a lot of, so when you talk about going back to like not recognizing China or whatever, I think it's like the problem isn't that we can't go back to like not recognizing China. It's the problem is that people were never like every time that they could have like still stood up for
Right.
American values, they didn't.
They didn't. And it's because when you normalize relations, you actually lose a key mechanism for trying to uphold values, right? Like, and this is one of the things that I think Congress has actually done a decent job of in the last 5 years or so, which is putting sanctions on certain companies that have been directly involved in human rights abuses, particularly with respect to Uyghurs, all right, which is like, okay, and I don't think these bills have gone far enough, but they're a good start, which is we're actually using now our trading power to sort of undo some of these, like we can trade anything all the time, to saying, okay, well, we're going to put restrictions on like some of the worst stuff where we know these products are made in places where people are, there's ethnic slave labor. And similar like sanctions on some officials, including Hong Kong officials, and I think a couple of people, who were persecuting Falun Gong and Tibet. But like these are mechanisms to actually do something, right? To uphold American values. And I think we need to do more of those things.
I do think though that when Congress did have to vote every year on whether to grant China normal trade status, that I don't believe they ever voted no.
No, they did not vote no.
Yeah.
But you can imagine that there's still pressure on the PRC to not be too horrible. But I think also if the pattern is that they always vote to approve, then over time the Communist Party sees this as like, oh, well, they're pushovers. So, at some point you do have to vote no if you see things going wrong. And it's like a slow erosion. I mean, it was a slow erosion anyway, right? Because it went from like, oh, we're approving it every year anyway, so we might as well normalize trade relations. We might as well let China into the WTO.
Oh, no, I don't think it was we might as well. It was actively pushing to include China in the WTO.
Right, because then they'll have to follow the rules-based international order.
Yeah, that's another thing that was a big mistake. The idea that like putting China in the UN or the WTO or whatever other international governing bodies there are would make them follow the international order.
When they can just create their own international.
Or actually,
Or
what they did was undermine those organizations from within and use those mechanisms to do things that were, favorable to them.
Yeah.
Right, like corrupting certain like UN organizations, corrupting the World Trade Organization,
Being on the UN
Anyway.
Human Rights Council, changing the definition in the UN of Hong Kong so it wasn't considered a colony, like so it wouldn't be granted the rights given to other former colonies. Like it's just, yeah.
Well, and I think you mentioned China viewing the U.S. as a pushover. I think it's really telling that right before Blinken arrived in China, the CCP released this footage of one of their submarines test firing nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. Right after he left, they did some more test runs of military drills near Taiwan for
I mean,
the
I don't
millionth
think,
time.
I guess in Blinken's defense, I don't think that it was like a super amicable meeting and that like he went and like caved on a bunch of stuff in
Sure,
person, you know.
But if Antony Blinken really had cojones, he would have told the pilot to turn that jet around in midair and not land in China. Like that's what I would have done, because that says like if you agree to then land and have that meeting right after the CCP has just given you the finger by doing these like missile tests, like you're basically letting them that piece of salami slicing and saying that's okay. We understand the CCP is salami slicing.
I don't think this is salami slicing. Technically, that's just it's showing disrespect to the U.S. And you're right; he should have been like, well, you could have said, well, fly to Taiwan instead.
Yeah, they would never do that.
I know.
Yeah, but he could have turned the plane around and flew back, or refueled in Tokyo or something. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't have to land in China.
Yeah, absolutely. And like that would be sending a message. That's the thing. Like the U.S. does have, even still, like it comes from a position of power. It just needs to be willing to use that.
Well, I think this is when we had
a podcast guest on to talk about this.
David
Stillwell. Okay, so Stillwell was the former Assistant Secretary of State for Asia Pacific.
Yes. Well, so we had him on. I think the first time he was talking a lot about reciprocity.
Right.
And the idea within the Trump-Pompeo State Department that the U.S. needed to just treat China with reciprocity.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to do this to us, like we will just like do that same thing, and then we'll see. It's not like disrespect to kind of like just have reciprocity on both sides. But I think the way that the Blinken State Department has treated China is like you almost have to like if there's like a lot of like don't offend them.
Mm-hmm.
Like
which was very much the strategy, definitely under the Obama administration, and I'm sure before.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the latter couple years of the Obama administration, there was a little bit of a change in that there was like obviously a built up of frustration,
mm-hmm.
and then they eventually kind of started to wise up, but not enough to like affect any like real meaningful change before Trump came in. But like the idea that first you have to worry about not angering China, right, in order to get them to the table to talk about things. And so that immediately cedes a lot of power to the CCP to get offended at a bunch of things and like to make it so that the State Department feels like they have to be on tenterhooks or like just like tiptoe around to not make things worse.
Yeah, it seems like their goal is the diplomacy, the talking. This is what you were saying earlier, Matt.
Right.
And so it seems like they'll give China whatever they want just so they can talk.
Right. There's very it should be obvious elementary school psychology here, right? Which is the CCP is the schoolyard bully. And Antony Blinken is acting like that kid that's constantly scared of that bully and so gives the bully his lunch money every single day because he's scared of the consequences of not doing it. Whereas like the actual way to resolve it is to stand up to that bully. And if it means building a coalition of other kids in your class who are all being picked on and standing up together, you'll be more powerful. But like those things aren't happening. It's just everyone's giving them their lunch money.
I think the problem is the U.S. is like picking the wrong kid. They're picking like the EU when they should be picking
Lithuania.
Well, I think that's part of it. But like they should be picking the Philippines, Vietnam, India,
As
Japan,
like the countries that are
South Korea,
ready to fight.
I mean, I do think that they are doing that more than they were before.
Yes.
But there's still, I think when Biden came in and he was kind of like, we're going to be, building consensus with our allies, not like Trump who just like went in and offended people and did whatever. But that was still like looking at it in a very kind of Eurocentric way where like it was like, oh, we need to rebuild our relationship with Europe, who would
Germany and France in particular.
And then, but the problem is that Europe doesn't really want to stand up to the CCP. I mean, they kind of are getting a little annoyed now with like flooding the CCP, flooding them with like cheap electric cars and some of this stuff. But for a long time they were just like, and also I think there's this thing where they didn't want to be the U.S. They didn't want to be like, they didn't want to follow the U.S. Like they wanted to be independent.
Right.
So they were like, okay, their approach to the China was that they will just be neutral. Like they're not going to get like,
Kind of like how they treated Russia.
yeah, and it didn't work out real well for them, right?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, like how much like Trump was pushing NATO countries to like pay more for defense, and they got really upset, and that was one of the reasons uh, people said that like, oh, Trump is angering our allies. He's not working. It's very bad. And then Ukraine war. And suddenly,
Or
maybe defense
or
was
what
a
was
good
that?
idea.
Wasn't there some clip of him saying something about like Europe getting gas from Russia and how that was like a bad idea?
It's very sad when Germany makes a massive oil and gas deal with Russia, where you're supposed to be guarding against Russia, and Germany goes out and pays billions and billions of dollars a year to Russia.
And it was, at the time, people mocked him for like offending Europeans for saying that or something like that. And then, of course, Russia invades Ukraine, and then like the gas pipelines become a huge deal.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Oops.
But I mean, sometimes a guy who's kind of a can be saying things that you do need to hear, even if you don't like the way he's saying
This
them.
is the premise of I can't think of the name of the movie with the puppet movie, Team America.
Oh, World Police. Okay.
World Police. Yeah, I can't say it on this kids friendly podcast, but there's a whole thing about I just said all the words. Bleep all of those out, Anderson, please. Yeah, I guess it's not the analysis of those words, it's those words themselves.
I mean, to be fair, you had already originally said.
Yeah.
I did.
And then I also said, so it'd already been 2 out of 3.
Huh. So the point is, sometimes you do need to. This has been culturally over the past couple of decades kind of a verboten thing in the U.S. that like the U.S. has power and can use that power to achieve its goals and achieve American values. Because there's sort of this idea of like, oh no, America, it's colonialist and it's white and it's bad. It should just, give up power and let, China become the new. We'll have the UN fix everything. And that doesn't work. Because there's, a Marxist-Leninist authoritarian regime that is trying to become the sole superpower in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that like, oh well, like the U.S. should stop being the world police, or every country should be able to do what they want for themselves, sounds nice, except that the majority of the world is authoritarian.
Yes.
And there are specifically authoritarian countries like China, like Russia, like Iran, like North Korea, who aren't just happy oppressing their own people, right?
Mm-hmm.
They also want to oppress other people too.
Yeah, like China, like everything China's doing in the Philippines. And that's another interesting thing that happened. Biden made a statement about how the U.S. will defend the Philippines. And then again, another group of Filipino ships were attacked by like a huge swarm of Chinese Coast Guards, water cannons. And like that's what the CCP is doing. Like, this is what Biden said. Is he really standing up for you? Maybe you should give up and join us.
Are we going to talk about the Philippines thing, the water cannon?
Yeah, I guess we can. Yeah. So this is another example of how like the Philippines is doing a great job of showing what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, instead of keeping these things kind of under wraps.
Yeah, so what I find funny about this whole thing, so this past week, there was like another Filipino, was it a Coast Guard ship?
There are 2 Coast Guard ships
who were basically attacked by they were trying to get to the Scarborough Shoal. And there have been Chinese maritime militia, Coast Guard camped out there for a while trying to keep people away, fishermen, away from the Scarborough Shoal and Filipino ships.
And for clarity, The Hague has ruled that the Scarborough Shoal is part of the Philippines' territory and not China's.
And that's another case where China just ignores the international laws and order that, we worked so hard to get them involved in.
But like what I found funny about this is that it turns out that the BBC, like there was a BBC reporter on one of the Filipino Coast Guard ships that got attacked by this water cannon. So
Wait, was that this time or the last time?
this time,
Hasn't there been another time since then?
No, but before that, there was also examples of foreign media stationed on the.
no, I mean like I'm looking at this BBC article
Oh, okay.
that's dated May 1st.
Right.
Okay.
There was another incident on a different shoal. This is near the
Marshall?
the
No.
second Thomas shoal. And in that case, there was also, I don't know if it was BBC, but there was definitely foreign correspondence
Okay,
think-
on the Filipino Coast Guard ships because, again, the Philippines, as you point out, is being smart by making sure that there's coverage of these sort of things that are happening.
Yeah, so now the BBC has published this article that's like close enough to see their faces chased down by China in the South China Sea. So it's like a very evocatively written, like,
Oh no, BBC reporting angers China.
You know what would have really angered China if their headline called it the West Philippine Sea?
Yeah. Except that might just be confusing for people, unfortunately.
It would, but I was kind of resistant to that change for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
But when you see all that the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia are doing in that area, that is, Filipino territory.
Yeah.
That like you can't keep calling it the South China Sea because it kind of feeds into this whole thing. And
That is a good point. Maybe we should think about how we talk about that.
yeah, but at least for now, because we have an opportunity to clarify.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, the Scarborough Shoal is essentially the West Philippine Sea. It has been Filipino territory for a very long time.
and I mean, it was also the case where like the Philippines weren't doing what the Chinese Coast Guard is doing now, which is trying to like keep everyone else away from it. Right. Like you had
Fishermen from other countries could go there and fish.
Because it was a natural harbor, say, like, I don't know, say spot in stormy waters.
Well, and also like because of what happens with the shoals and reefs, it's like it's a natural place for fish to spawn and build up. So it's like a great fishing spot, right?
We learned that from the Filipino fishermen. We were on their boat going there.
Yeah. And I remember looking over the bow and seeing like all these giant Chinese ships like surrounding the shoal and being, probably not as terrified as I ought to have been.
Yeah, in hindsight, that was one of the more dangerous, stupid things we've done. Let's go out into the open ocean where the CCP is being super aggressive.
I think it's one of the best things we've done.
I mean, yes, those are not necessarily exclusive.
But I was reading this BBC article and I was just like, it was really dumb of the CCP in a way, because now you have this article from the BBC that's saying things like this ship was accosted by a Chinese vessel. It's talking about how the Chinese ships were like trying to stop them, and then like the ship cut across them, and then they were like, they began firing their powerful water cannon. Like we could hear the jets of water thundering against the metal walls. They smashed the awning in the stern and mangled a railing on one side.
That's the British using the English language.
And so it's just like talking about how bad the damage was on the other ship, and just like it's very evocative of the CCP or like the Coast Guard being very aggressive.
And
right?
for clarity, it was 2 Filipino maritime patrol boats, and they ran into 4 Chinese Coast Guard vessels and 6 Chinese maritime militia ships.
Yeah, so they were being surrounded and hemmed in by these other ships. It's different when you have this like war of words, when you have like the CCP claiming one thing and you have the Filipino Coast Guard claiming another thing, and now you have like the BBC who's like in the middle, and they're like, it's like a on the ground, like
It's not just words. There's
Yes.
like real consequences.
And there's drone footage
And they are
helicopter footage, which is great.
essentially like contesting the CCP's version of things, and yeah, it's just like
Right.
also apparently they've put back up a barrier that the Philippines cut down, right?
Yeah,
like
at the Scarborough Shoal.
So yeah, it's funny that they can't back down, but there's no way for them to really spin this without without like the complicity of the Filipino government. I think what happened with the previous administration is like that because they were trying to be more friendly with China and the CCP, like they would also downplay it. So like you kind of need both sides to downplay it for the CCP to get away with the bullying tactics. So now that the Philippines is like standing up and being like, okay, well, we're going to film it. We're going to cut the barricades. We're going to bring foreign journalists on our ships so they can see what's happening. It's much harder for the CCP to be like, oh, well, we were just defending our territory. They were the aggressors,
Right.
And
this is a really good example also of how to deal with powerful, aggressive regimes, which is that like China's strength is military. They've got like a lot more ships. They've got a lot of weapons. And I consider water cannons to be a weapon.
That would be a good place to mention, too, what that report Shelley saw. Speaking of the size of their military.
Right. But my point, which I want to make first, is that the Philippines doesn't have the military firepower to fight back against China. And even if they started to fight back with water cannons or something more aggressive, like they could risk actually starting a war. But instead, the Philippines understands that they have a more powerful weapon on their side that the Communist Party cannot compete against. And that weapon is truth. So the Philippines has this strategy of like, we're just going to show the truth of what's happening. And they do that with video footage, right? And they've been doing a great job of this consistently for, almost a year now, I think. And that's a weapon that the CCP can't really defend against, right? The more you allow foreign correspondence, the more you allow footage, the more you make public every little thing that the CCP is doing to this much smaller, less powerful, less militarized country. That's actually a point the Philippines wins. So smart.
Well, let me hold you to task for your anti-China rhetoric. You talk about truth, Matt, and you say that you can't work with China. Let me tell you a story about an African-American businessman, Elon Musk, who went to China same time as Blinken, and he met with officials. He posted on Twitter how he had the honor of meeting Premier Li Qiang, whom he knows from back in the Shanghai days, that people-to-people communication. And he went to this big auto show. And hey, you know what? China pulled back a lot of the restrictions they had on Tesla. There were these concerns about, the Tesla cars could be picking up information, basically being used as spy vehicles for the American government.
I now have a question about all the Chinese electric vehicles.
No. I'm making a point here,
Okay.
Shelley. Don't bring that kind of garbage up. And so he worked with them. He met face to face, people communication, says nice things about China.
I just
Believer
want to
in
know,
free speech, and then those restrictions got pulled back on Tesla.
Yeah,
We got to work with China.
I mean, I think it's also with it. Now the CCP finds themselves in a different position than they did as well when they were doing all the restrictions on Tesla, right?
Maybe the economy's not quite as good.
And maybe their electric vehicles aren't as welcome around the world as they were hoping.
Maybe they've scared away a lot of foreign business
Yeah.
from investing in China.
Yeah, so having, this African American billionaire who's willing to praise China and, keep his factories there, and it's pretty important suddenly.
Speaking of Africa, did you guys see that video that's going viral? Put it up on screen.
I did not, because I did see that you posted it on Instagram, but Instagram hid it because it was sensitive content.
Sensitive content. It is. I kind of get why, because I mean, it's this Chinese businessman employer whipping his African employees with his belt. That's what they meant by the Belt and Road.
Did you just come up with that?
I used that in the post.
Oh, okay.
So I came up with that then. But yeah, it's awful. China talks about being friends with the global South, criticizing American
I mean, that's just
colonialism.
one Chinese guy.
That's true. It's certainly not representative of a much deeper issue, a cancer, a rot. So I'm just surprised Elon Musk, as an African, now American businessman, he's not more concerned about some of the human rights abuses that China is doing. I wonder why he's not.
Because sometimes smart people can be really stupid. Yeah, I mean, this does go back to like Elon Musk over the last decade having overinvested in China. Well, almost anything is an overinvestment in China, but like including trying to reduce manufacturing costs by setting up a bunch of Tesla and battery facilities, manufacturing in China. Basically, he gave up his own power by doing that because now Tesla is so heavily invested in China that regardless of what Elon Musk, the man, may think about China and the CCP, he's now sort of stuck in that environment and could lose an incredible amount were he to pull out. Now, I don't know if that's what he would want to do anyway, right? He may just be so hoodwinked by the whole thing that he's fine with it, but he has sacrificed any leverage he might have had.
Well, yeah, I don't. Well, first of all, I think the theme of this episode is people giving up their power to authoritarian regimes. But yeah, I don't get Musk because like he'll do this thing where it's like, I don't care if I lose advertisers. I'm about free speech. Like I don't care about the money. It's the values.
Right. The advertisers can go F themselves, but he'll never say that about the CCP.
Well, yeah, like he's posting about how this TikTok bill, it's not a good thing. And he repeats Communist Party talking points.
It's about the First Amendment.
It's about the First Amendment.
Is he afraid that Twitter is going to be banned? I mean,
well, that is one of the talking points.
But Twitter is owned by an American citizen, which is himself.
Well, I mean, I think in his post about it, he was like, this TikTok bill would actually be beneficial to X, but I'm still against it. He actually kind of made it.
Again, that I don't care about the money. I care about what's right. Then why are you doing business in China?
It's because, as I said, smart people can be stupid. Right? It's so easy to be blind to your own, you're smart at this narrow range of things. And for Elon Musk, it's actually a broad range of things. But he's still got blinders on when it comes to human rights. He's still got blinders on when it comes to certain aspects of protecting American values.
Well, so speaking of these attempts at diplomacy involving the Chinese Communist Party, the White House is welcoming China's attempts to be a mediator in the Middle East, and now China is holding talks between Hamas and Fatah, the two main powers in Palestine.
Well, there's no Palestine.
Well, yeah, because I don't even want to repeat those jokes, those things people say online. People say horrible things online, but you know what I mean,
right? Hamas is in charge of Gaza, which is the part that's attacking Israel, and Fatah is in charge of the West Bank, which is the other
sort of
the Palestinian-controlled area.
It's the Palestinian Authority,
right?
Which is usually what it's called in English language media.
And I think it's, in many ways, I think most of our viewers know what's going on there anyway in Israel. But like it is a little strange. It's unusual to have a country where you have parts of that country that are fully administered by another government, right? But that's what Israel is sort of dealing with. And one of those parts is attacked Israel on October 7th, and there's this whole war, right?
And as we discussed in last week's podcast with Germont Hilary, that he made a very convincing claim that China may have had a hand in the October 7th massacre.
Yeah, and I think the whole thing with, he was mentioning Hamas and the Palestinian Authority both meeting with China, and the idea that they may not be as far off from each other as like conventional like
Hmm.
you know, um, ideas have that like the idea is that like they don't like each other because the Palestinian Authority essentially lost power to Hamas in elections in Gaza, and then they control the West Bank. And there have been no elections in the West Bank because they're also afraid they will lose control in the West Bank to Hamas.
Hmm.
So the idea is that they don't like each other, but Guermont's point was that they may be closer than
Hmm.
like
So
publicly.
yeah, connected a lot by the CCP. So the idea that the CCP is hosting the two of them as like this, they're going to meet, they're going to create peace between these two opposing sides.
I mean, the CCP recognizes um, the Palestinian state in a sense. So like there is a um, embassy in China that's like so like the Palestinian Authority is like the recognized government according to like China's like um diplomatic efforts. So uh they it's kind of like them brokering.
Vassal states.
Well,
That's maybe well, I don't know. That might be pretty accurate. I don't know.
yeah, I don't know about that, but like it is kind of like them being like, okay, I was gonna say like the KMT and the DPP or something like that, but I don't know if that's the right analogy.
It's also not the right analogy because neither of those groups is like actively attacking mainland China or anyone else.
It's too bad. West Taiwan really needs to be a thing.
But at any rate, it is weird that these two groups are basically meeting in China for peace talks. Like the CCP really cares about peace.
Well, I mean, they did successfully negotiate something between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Which was another interesting thing that
Right.
G-Man was making. That's also part of them breaking uh, peace talks and agreements the U.S. was making, and also leveraging Iran to also attack Israel, and basically creating this situation of instability to weaken and exhaust the U.S. And yeah, I mean, we know what's his name, that Marxist millionaire with ties to the CCP.
Oh, Rory Neville Singh?
Yeah, who seems to have provided some kind of support to at least the Colombia protesters. You see that video of somebody praising North Korea at that protest?
Oh, I think that was at
Was that UCLA?
UCLA.
Yeah.
Yeah, or was it? I'm just getting
Atlanta.
confused now.
It was a different university, but the point is, yeah, a pro-Palestine protester praising North Korea or, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Yeah, the guy said the DPRK. So anytime somebody comes to a microphone or has a megaphone and starts talking about the DPRK,
You know what side they're on.
yes, they are on the side of the DPRK.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been very, very advantageous to the Chinese Communist Party, because when these protests somehow start going, like they talk about Palestine, but then it morphs into, the real problem is the United States. We need to get rid of the United States, and maybe socialism is a good idea. You can kind of see that, like, this is a great help to the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, this is a well-known, long-standing communist tactic of taking advantage of fault lines in society and exploiting that to further divide people, make things more extreme.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah. However, I think the CCP's plans are backfiring.
And what's that?
Because never before has the left and right in America been so unified, because we had protesters on the pro-Israel and the pro-Palestine side both chanting "F Biden." Americans have never been more united.
Due to what the Communist Party is doing?
Well, it's taking the premise that they were at least partially responsible for the attacks that created all this protest.
Oh, I see.
With the intention to divide America, but instead the end result was that it was united. I know. Try to keep up with me, Shelley. I'm firing on all cylinders today. I got my coffee.
How many cylinders?
4 cylinders, Shelley. I can go 0 to 60 in like 20 seconds.
All right. Well, at any rate, I
have clearly left you both behind in the dust
Mhm.
produced by my mind. Mind dust.
yes, very good, Chris.
We should create a supplement called Mind Dust. That sounds like a drug.
But it's a supplement that you pay for, but you don't take
What?
I don't
because
get-
you don't want mind dust, right?
No, we're selling Mind Dust, Matt.
Why
This
would-
is why you need Mind Dust, because your brain is so far behind mine.
I just keep hearing mine dust, like coal mines mine.
Mine Dust. Which
it's like
coincidentally
mind pillow.
is great to take if you're a coal miner and you are dealing with mind dust or mine dust. You should have mind dust.
I can see this is going to be a great advertising campaign.
Leave your
and-
comments below if you want China Uncensored brand mind dust. It's a nootropic and will alpha sigma mail you to the Riz.
To the Riz.
Keep up, Shelley. I'm a sigma.
Okay, I don't know what that is.
You don't know what a sigma is? You're
No.
looking at it.
Okay. A guy who isn't wearing pants?
Don't tell them my secrets. I've laced your drinks with
With
mine dust.
dust.
You're in for a trip.
Ugh.
Oh,
That explains why I've been so sharp during this podcast. All right, before my mind completely disintegrates into dust, do we want to talk about how the CCP has been treating the U.S. campus protests?
That's a great connection. After that sip of mine dust, it's already the cylinders. You're catching up, Shelley.
yes, my
Let's leave Matt
cylinders
behind and-
are
well, you had
firing,
some
huh?
too. Yeah. It's 4 cylinders. Woo!
All 4.
All right.
How fast can you have? Wow. Mines usually don't have cylinders.
here we go.
All right, Matt.
Okay,
Oh my
chug,
God.
chug,
No,
chug,
no,
chug,
that's
chug.
too much. Oh God.
Whoa! Oh man!
This is not FDA approved.
It's okay. The FDA doesn't approve supplements, so it's okay.
Yeah.
All right, Shelley, let's talk about how the CCP views those protests. Woohoo!
China Uncensored is not responsible for death or injuries caused by mine dust.
I feel like I'm the only sane person in between a lot of crazy right now.
We'll have another drink.
No thanks. I was going to say that the CCP is very supportive of these, young, noble, idealistic American students who are
Really?
standing up for what's right in the world
Oh.
and calling out U.S. hypocrisy,
Mm.
facing the U.S. police who are using undue force on these brave protesters.
That's right. Gosh, I mean, the CCP would never use undue force on protesters.
And also, the U.S. is definitely hypocritical because they support protests elsewhere, all around the world, except in the U.S.
False flags kind
Yeah.
of stuff. Is that
Yeah,
what
yeah.
they're getting at?
Yeah, or even just saying the Huachun tweeted, who's like a foreign ministry spokesperson. Remember how U.S. officials reacted when these protests happened elsewhere?
She doesn't even
yeah.
want to say Hong Kong. She
Yeah.
just says elsewhere. Like,
Yeah, the U.S. officials supported protests in Hong Kong. Why won't they support protests in their own country? It's because they're big fat hypocrite.
yeah, and there was no police crackdown elsewhere.
No. I mean, that was just restoring order.
Right.
That was just restoring stability.
I
Matt.
felt a lot more stable after being repeatedly tear gassed.
a lot more stable, similar to how you just were 20 seconds ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Shelley.
I actually do remember after we were on October 1st, like
2019.
2019 in Hong Kong, which is the national day, right? And just like repeatedly tear gassed. Watching you pull off your like gas mask at the end of the day, and
Uh-huh.
your face was just like the debris from like you had like a line
Of like
of
debris
like,
outside where the
like,
mask was. Yeah.
and yeah, it was fun times.
Those were great times for nobody. Those, of course, were protests elsewhere, but protests in the United States are good.
Which is also ridiculous because it's not like these protests are not being supported. They have a right to protest. What's happening, though, is that when they break the law, like, they can't do some of the things that they're doing.
Yeah, I read this interesting article that was written by a guy who had covered the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
and was also now covering some protests in, I think it was like Humboldt, California, so way northern California. And he was just kind of comparing the two protests
Yeah.
and being like, well, they're completely different, basically, because he was like interviewing the Humboldt students, and a lot of people didn't kind of know what they were protesting for exactly.
Yeah, well,
Or
and like a lot of these people are like not even students at the universities; they're outsiders coming in.
yeah, but
You need more mind dust.
well, I was gonna say the some of these groups that are supporting the protests say you shouldn't make a distinction between the students and the outsiders. You know,
Yeah, I was gonna quote something the Free Press wrote about how the Palestinian activist group Action US released a guide saying, they need to escalate and build more militancy, including militant direct actions and getting outsiders to come in. So this is not like a peaceful student protest, especially when a Jewish student was stabbed in the eye, and they're calling for like murder.
I mean, I think what's really saving these protests from becoming more violent is the fact that a lot of these kids are just like,
They like
know,
the interpretive dance.
well, that they may want to escalate, but they're not actually like
Physically fit.
Do you remember seeing this video of this woman in Bakersfield, California, who was at this city council meeting, and then she was yelling at the city council for doing something, and she basically said something about how like, it was like just she was making a really strident speech,
Mm-hmm.
and then she ended it with like, "We're gonna murder all of you in your beds," or something like that. "We're gonna come to your homes and murder you," and then. It's almost hilarious because then it's like the city council announcer just being like, "Next speaker, blah, blah, blah." And then one of the city council reps is like, "That was a threat and the police will be escorting you out now." It's just like the idea that you can't just, threaten to murder people and have no consequences
Yeah.
because
You are a revolutionary, an
Yeah, like,
activist,
what
doing what's right.
but what they've been taught is that like it's okay to say this kind of things, like that one guy from Colombia, Kamani James, who was saying like all this stuff about how he could murder Zionists. He's not gonna, but like, and he posted it on the internet and then got suspended by Colombia, and then apologized because he was like, "Oh yeah, I got carried away." Because he actually had to face some kind of consequences.
Yeah.
Right. Or those kids who took over that like building in Columbia. And then there was that video of like one of their spokespeople who was a PhD student. So not an undergrad, who was, being like, "Well, we demand that Columbia, let in like food and water, like provide humanitarian aid." And the reporter's like, "Have they, stopped food and
Oh,
water
yeah.
from going in?" And then she was like, "Not that we're like preemptively," like, and she was saying a bunch of stuff about how, do you want students to be starved and dehydrated? Like, what kind of a community are we building at Columbia? And there was one reporter who was like, "So it kind of sounds like
You want
you
catering.
want to, have this revolution, but you also want like for them to bring you food. Yeah, it's just I think that is what is actually saving these protests from becoming more violent, is that like these people have no idea of like what they're doing essentially. They're getting fired up. Like there's like I think there's a lot of like idealism and excitement about certain things, but then like they don't actually understand that like everybody who broke into that building is going to get expelled.
They should, yeah.
I mean, it might take a while to actually do it, but like they're going to get expelled. Like it's just like there are consequences to things, and like you can't just go around saying like demanding whatever you want and expect that to be given to you. Like if that's not how anything works.
Well, this is a good example of how communism seeps its way into American schools. Like there was a Brazilian Marxist, Paulo Freire, who wrote this big book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is basically the idea that to get kids interested, or to just get people interested in learning, you have to kind of talk about things that get them fired up, which sounds good. But then this is like sort of an activist kind of education where you talk about things that agitate kids, oppression, et cetera, et cetera. So what he said was so you could create perpetual cultural revolution. And this got imported into American schools. And so now you have the issue where kids are taught how to be activists and how to be offended, but they don't actually learn how to like read or organize.
Right. Because I think what happened is research showed that when you're basically firing kids up all the time on political activism instead of actually teaching them the core subjects they're supposed to learn, they're actually psychologically like they're always agitated and they're always worried and they're always like their minds are not able to focus on the core things like reading and mathematics and so on.
I mean,
So-
I don't think they're probably teaching university students how to read at that point, but I'm
Right. I mean, this is more like K through 12 education, but not.
Yeah.
But I mean,
And I
that's
think
what.
it's part of the reason why we see literacy rates dropping.
Yeah. I mean, Columbia, as one of the most elite schools in the entire country, probably has 100% literacy rate among its students, right? And my understanding is your freshman year in particular is very challenging because they make you read a tremendous amount.
So this is the person who was like the spokeswoman who I was talking about, who was like demanding that Columbia not let students starve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so her name is Joanna King-Slutsky. I just want to read what her PhD thesis is on.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
Fantasies of limitless energy in the transatlantic romantic imagination from 1760 to 1860. A prehistory of metabolic rift, Marxist term for the disruption of energy circuits caused by industrialization under capitalism. I'm particularly interested in theories of the imagination and poetry as interpreted through a Marxian lens in order to update and propose an alternative to historicist ideological critiques of the romantic imagination.
You can barely even pronounce those words.
What?
That's crazy.
When you get your PhD and that's your thesis, where do you go from there? There's only one path, right? Which is academia.
And then you can teach the next generation
Right,
your crazy
because-
theories.
No, because like what company is going to hire you, right? Like, or like, how is it useful for starting a business? It's not really, right?
Well, fortunately, you can create the DEI initiatives, and then she could get a job at a major corporation teaching
don't-
about historically exploitative systems and how those companies can fix it.
I don't know if those companies care about a historically revisionist reading of the romantic imagination from 1760 to 1860.
I do wonder what the backgrounds and the education of the people who are in these DEI consultancy groups, or the people who get hired for those.
But at any rate, like this is the person who's like a spokesperson for the students who broke in to that academic building on Columbia campus.
And the crazy thing is, it doesn't help Palestinians. It doesn't help Israelis.
You're sure this doesn't help bring peace in the Middle East?
It doesn't help anyone.
Well, I think this is like, there is a certain amount of, because there's these people are really sheltered. Like, I think it's
Yeah.
interesting that, I mean, they're mostly like white upper middle class kids from teenagers and young 20-some-year-olds from like privileged families.
Yeah, wasn't Ilham Amar's daughter like one of them, and she was complaining about how she's now homeless?
I'm pretty sure she's not homeless.
Well,
But
no, but like that's her. It's all LARPing.
well, I think the problem is that like again, you kind of are in this like very sheltered place. And there was something I was reading about how one of their demands is that like there's no consequences for their actions, essentially. Like they don't want any students to have to face any disciplinary action for what they did as part of these protests. Like they want their arrest records to be expunged. Like it is like they want to be a revolutionary but not take responsibility for any of their actions.
I mean, gosh, they're making me praise Mao. At least Mao, like people were shooting at him. He had to go through the Long March.
Oh, wow.
And
I didn't see that coming.
I know, neither did I. But that's how far advanced my mind dust has got me. My brain is ahead of where I am.
Uh-huh.
So what you're saying is that even Mao understood that there were consequences for leading a revolution, and he
had to like
and
was willing to
sacrifices.
suffer something.
Mostly sacrificing other people.
That's true. He was very good at that, and it kind of explains his insane hedonism later in life. He was making up for lost time.
Like I felt for a while that it's almost like looking at protests that we've seen in Hong Kong or something like through like a funhouse mirror. You know what I mean? Like it's there's like on the surface some similarities, but like the core like ideological principles driving the Hong Kong protests were fairly different, and what happened with those protests is pretty different. And the people, I mean, how many? There's like over 1,000 Hong Kong like prisoners of conscience now, like people who participated in those protests, and they're now in prison.
Yeah.
In Hong Kong. And so the people went into it understanding that there were these things that could happen to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Because they were going up against the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes. And it kind of drives me up the wall to then see, people at Columbia complaining that the school is not going to let in food and water when they haven't not let in food and water.
And also, they could just leave that building anytime they want and go to the cafeteria.
Yeah. And that's one of the things the reporter asked in that. Yeah, and we've seen interviews with some of these people who they don't know what they're protesting. They don't really know what their demands are. Like what are they trying to do? It's somewhere like, well, we don't want the university to do exchanges with Israel or something.
I mean, at least that it's like a coherent thought. Like some people in the Humboldt protests that this one guy was interviewing people were just like making demands that had nothing to do with like the Palestinian stuff. Like it was just like,
I want a football helmet filled with cottage cheese.
No, it was just kind of like kind of random leftist stuff that wasn't related to the Palestinian protests.
Okay.
But anyway, I can't remember the specifics, but he was kind of contrasting that with the Orange Revolution being like, these were Ukrainians who had skin in the game. Like they were protesting and they knew why they were protesting.
Did you say Ukrainians?
Yeah, he was comparing it to the Orange Revolution in 2004.
Okay.
Because he had been there reporting on the Orange Revolution. So he was talking about what a different protest it was from, and that's also kind of how I feel about Hong Kong. Like the stakes are so different that it does feel like LARPing. And I feel a little bad saying that because I do think that there are people who, as part of these protests, who like genuinely do want to, make the world a better place. And they genuinely do want like peace in the Middle East, although I don't think they've thought about how that happens, right?
There's a reason why nobody before them has figured that out.
Yeah. Well, I think that like I don't think everybody is cynical or everyone is just like LARPing in the sense that everyone's just like playing around. I think there are people who have, like genuinely want to be like altruistic and like want to like make change in the world. It's just like they're just very confused.
Right.
And they're being taken advantage of by people who
are actual Marxists who have infiltrated the college campuses, because that's exactly what's been happening. And these like funded groups, outside groups, are coming in and essentially infiltrating and, in many senses, probably leading some of the activities.
I mean,
Because
I don't
the
think
issue is never the issue. The issue is revolution.
I don't think it's just outside groups though. I think that
For example, Columbia PhD students.
well, I think like yeah, like the whole idea that like it's only outside agitators coming in is a little bit like of a double-edged sword, right?
Right. And I'm not saying it's only them, but you can't deny the influence of that.
Yeah, I mean, People's Forum is involved. Like, it's the organization that's tied to that Neville Roy Singh person. There's other groups that have been tied to other, like, well-funded, like kind of Marxist pro-Palestinian groups, or in general Marxist socialist groups. So there are a lot of people who, yeah, they want to change the conversation from it just being about these colleges should divest from Israel to actually what we need to do is bring down the American empire.
Yep. Some dots got connected somewhere.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because I was reading some of these pamphlets that were being passed around the colleges, and there was like a real, like an attempt to like redefine the idea of solidarity. Which is like the idea of solidarity. Like most people, if you heard solidarity, you'd be like, oh yeah, you want to be in support of other like similar protests or like groups around the world or whatever issues. But they were redefining solidarity to be like, well, solidarity just being like, oh, saying you support the Palestinians isn't enough. Like true solidarity, you have to take action. And the number one supporter of the state of Israel is the U.S. So, and we're in the U.S., so you have to take action against the U.S. So fundamentally, to be in solidarity with the Palestinians, you have to oppose the American empire and essentially like bring down the U.S.
And China smiles.
Yeah.
Yep. Shelley, that mind dust did some good things for you. And it can do some good things for you, too. Let us know in the comments if you'd like us to create a fake meme supplement. We could probably do that. It'll be mostly talcum powder.
I don't think you should be eating talcum powder.
But the FDA doesn't review things, right? It's mostly non-toxic, right? They give it to babies to eat.
They do not give it to babies to eat.
I don't know how these things work. Anyways, pre-order your mind dust today.
No, don't.
You should make it mostly baking soda. Then at least it'll relieve some of the indigestion from reading the news.
That's a good idea. That mind dust really is working. Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chang.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
We'll talk to you next time.